In our last movie, we took a look at some of the render options or export formats that are available when you work with just a little renderer that you can call up and look at any single frame in your animation to examine brushstrokes and render effects, those types of things. Well, let's take a look at some of the others. And at this point, let's talk about some of the changes or additions, improvements that have been made to Anime Studio Pro. A big one is that you can actually now export brushstrokes. We haven't looked at that yet. Very easy to apply to a strokes. We'll actually see this in some of the movies following this where I'm working on projects and we're creating specific looks and styles. The movies that follow this are actually a culmination of everything we've learned, and we'll look at some of the advanced techniques that you can use this program for that we haven't covered as we've covered the basics up to this point. Well, let's say we've got our animation and there's no movement going on here or anything, that's fine. But I'm going to show you the options we've got when we go ahead and come up to File, Export. We don't want import, we want export animation. There we go. And if you've got multiple movies all at once, something that has some high density particles in it that may take a while, you want to go eat lunch first, you can go ahead and batch export several movies at once and have the renderer work while you're gone and come back and they can be done if time's an issue. Usually renderings happen pretty fast, especially if you're working with just pure vector layers. Well, when I select the export option, we have, like you do at the beginning in the project settings, you can determine what frame you want to start at and what frame you want to end at. Nice feature in case you're working with an editor and they say, well, can we change the last 5 seconds of this? You don't have to re-render the entire animation. If there's special effects going on, that's a time saver, kind of nice there. If you've got different ranges set, you can just click entire animation. Now here's where we have some other options. Let's take a look at them. Anti-aliased edges, you're probably familiar with that. I always have that checked unless I actually want a very pixelated kind of retro techno look. The apply shape effects, when you have special effects, and we'll see these again in the movies that are coming up later, that they're actually applied to the shapes, and layer effects. We've looked at some of those options. We have other things that are time savers. They're mostly convenience things for your sake if you're just proofing an animation at a smaller file size. Render at half dimensions, render at half frame rate, reduce particles, smooth images. Here's where you enable use NTSC safe colors. It's in this export option right here. Also under particles, we looked at the option to not use pre-multiplied alpha channels. I won't go into all the compositing tricks that are done in video, but there's reasons you do and don't do that. And we covered a little bit of that for particles when you're using something actually in Anime Studio Pro. The final one that's grayed out is actually variable line widths. If you've got line weight changes, thick to thin, kind of like we do here with a little square, and you export to a flash format, you actually have to engage this button here, this option, to get those thick and thins to show up. Otherwise, they won't. And I might as well mention now, in the flash format, you do have the ability to export gradients now. That's nice. The only thing that doesn't come across is the layer effects in flash formats, things like drop shadows, those blurred type of effects that you may use in Flash already. As part of Flash, you can't export those functions. You can really only export the image files that don't have a lot of complex animation, bitmap image ones, but ultimately the best out of Anime Studio Pro is going to be your vector formats. Smallest file sizes, greatest sophistication when you do your animation. Now that I've said that, let's look at the options we have under Output Format. We've got QuickTime Movie, and then we've got a host of different options that you can choose from. The ones that we saw in the quick render files, they're all here. But we also have the ability to do PSD files. That's another, well, Photoshop format. Another file format that supports alpha information. And this is where you can select your Flash format. If you want to export to a format like TIFF or something like that, that is when you would actually use, in my case, QuickTime Movie, and then I would change the options in the QuickTime setting to something else. Let's pop into the QuickTime Movie settings now. And if you don't have QuickTime, you're working on a PC, then you'll have some other options available to you, notably the AVI export option, which has been improved in Anime Studio Pro. It's kind of the lowest common denominator codec for PCs that all PCs have, but you can still get some good results with it. It just makes larger file sizes. QuickTime Movie, I'll select OK. We'll get a dialog showing up, and we can say, well, what do you want to name it, and where do you want to send it? We're going to send this to the animation rendering folder here, part of the working files. But when I click Save, we're going to get yet another window with more options. And this is where you set movie options when they come out. This is where you set codec options when you're working with something that's got codecs. We can change the frame per second here. But most notably, I want to call your attention to the codec called Animation. If you have QuickTime Pro, and you can get it for PC or Mac, the animation codec, when you take the quality level all the way up to best, is a lossless compression scheme. Preserves your work perfectly. Anything less than best, and animation turns into a lossy compression scheme. Designed specifically for animation, areas with large flat color. It's not quite as efficient for, pixel-based images, something where you'd be working with bitmap files. I've got a host of compression schemes you may not have if you don't work with video editing software. Here's the BMP format, the legacy SynPack format, the H.264 format, and others that have their own options. And quality settings. Let's look real briefly at some of the destructive things that happen when using a codec. Some of these don't allow you to go low. The H.264 does, but you're not going to see the types of image corruption that you see when you're going with something like a SynPack codec, where when you drag it all the way down to least, you start getting some just terrible artifacts going around it, items like that. You get smaller file sizes, but they look ugly, frankly. In our next and last movie in this section, we'll take a look at some of the things to consider when working with SWF formats or flash format exports.